I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us, a very talented writer. Hasn't been on in a while. He actually ran for Congress at one point. Did reasonably well in his district. He's got three websites: theendoftheamericandream.com, theMostImportantNews.com, and the economiccollapseblog.com. I am talking to you about the founder and writer, Michael Snyder. Michael Snyder, thanks for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Hey, Greg, it's great to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
You are a prolific writer. All your stuff ends up all over the internet, including places like Zero Hedge and things like that. And one of your themes is the debt, which is one of my themes, the debt. And one of your latest data points on the debt, the global debt, the profound debt, the unpayable debt, the debt. And that is the point that you have where you're one of your latest articles that talks about 47% of GDP. This is definitely the scariest corporate debt bubble in history. That the debt of corporations is something like $10 trillion, and it's grown 50-something% since 2008. Can we start there with the debt? We can break into the debt right there with the corporate debt being astronomical.
Yeah. People need to understand our financial system is far more vulnerable today, right now, than it was in 2008. And corporate debt is a big part of that because you've got all these big corporations out there. And what happened, of course, the last crisis came and the Federal Reserve pushed interest rates all the way to the floor. And that has fueled the greatest corporate debt binge in all of U.S. history, where corporations have gone on this massive debt binge. So many of our largest corporations are massively overextended. They can barely service their debt payments, and we're still in relatively stable times. And so at this point, as you just mentioned, that we just got these numbers just came out. Corporate debt of those companies that are traded on the stock exchanges has increased since 2008 by 52%. It's now sitting at about $10 trillion, which is equivalent to about 47% of GDP. But actually, Forbes has pointed out if you include all other forms of corporate debt for companies not listed on the stock exchanges, well, that brings the total up to $15.5 trillion, which is equivalent to about 74% of GDP. Never seen anything like this before in all of U.S. history, Greg, but that's just one form of debt, how our society is drowning in debt, and that people need to realize the only reason why we have any sort of prosperity in this country today is because it's fueled by debt. We've been building up this bubble. It's the bubble to end all bubbles. So you look at consumers. U.S. consumers are now $14 trillion in debt, all-time record. State and local governments are at all-time record levels of debt. The U.S. government, back in 2008, we were $10 trillion in debt. Now we just hit $23 trillion in debt, more than doubled since the last time around, Greg. And what we're doing to future generations of Americans is beyond criminal, because we are literally stealing more than $100 million from future generations of Americans every single hour of every single day. It's a crime beyond comprehension, and it's been going on for over a decade. In fact, we've been adding more than $1 trillion a year to the national debt for more than a decade now. In fact, just since last Thanksgiving, we've added $1.3 trillion to the national debt. And that's the primary thing that the federal government does that helps the economy or stimulates the economy in the short term. Of course, in the long term, it's extremely destructive. We're literally destroying the future in order to make the present better. But if the government didn't do this, for example, if we went back over the last since Barack Obama entered the White House, and we pulled out all that money, approximately over $12 trillion since Barack Obama entered the White House, which we've added to the national debt, we would be in the worst economic depression in American history right now. And so people say, oh, Trump's in office. He knows what he's doing with the economy. Well, the truth is he's simply doing what Barack Obama did, which was spend money like there's no tomorrow, explode the size of the deficit, explode the size of our debt, which, pumping all that money into the economy helps in the short term, although it's not actually helping that much. Because in terms of economic growth, in order to have a good year, we've got to have a year of 3% economic growth. And we haven't had that since the middle of the Bush administration. So at no point have we had any sort of a booming economy at any point. But what all this debt has bought for us is more time to expand the bubble of relative stability. Meanwhile, we are literally committing national suicide. We are literally destroying the future of this country, the future of this republic, everything that since the founders, every generation of Americans have built, we are destroying by our insatiable greed in this generation, Greg.
National suicide. How does this? I mean, I have a theory about Trump, and my theory is we were never going to pay this back the day he gets to the White House. He 20 trillion the day he walks in the door. And then they go, oh, Mr. President, there's another 21 trillion. That's secret, missing money. And then on top of that, who knows what else. So at what point were we never going to pay it back? I don't know. I think we can go back to the long-term capital management. I think that's when we were never going to pay it back. And nobody ever intended to. So how does this end? I mean, we don't intend, if Trump did try to pay off the debt, which he couldn't, which is going to blow up, how does this end? He couldn't do it anyway. The whole thing would crash anyway. So what do you think the end game is going to look like here, and how fast are we going to get to the end game? And with this big sell-off in the stock market the last few days, is that a signal that the end game is coming? What does the end game look like, and how fast are we going to get there? That's my question.
Well, we've been expanding the size of our debt much faster than the economy's been growing for a very long time. So a lot of people have been lulled into a sense of complacency thinking, well, we can just keep doing this. No, it's mathematically impossible. In fact, the whole world's doing it. In fact, Bloomberg reported the other day the size of the total amount of all debt in the world is now up to $250 trillion. And what this has been created by central banking, where you go back to 1913 with here in the United States, where the Federal Reserve System was brought in, and it was literally designed to create as much debt as possible to enrich the bankers, of course, and to those we owe the debt to. But it was designed to create an endless debt spiral. And since that time, the size of the U.S. national debt has gotten thousands of times larger. And then, of course, the rest of the world has adopted central banking too. In fact, at this point, more than 99.9% of the population of the world lives in a country with a central bank. I talked all about this in a recent article. And so we can't get the whole world to agree on anything, but somehow we've gotten the whole world to agree that central banking is the way to go, this debt-based system, which ends up getting everybody in a debt spiral from which there's no escape. And eventually, this whole thing is going to come crashing down. Eventually, I mean, this thing is not sustainable by nature. And in fact, here in the United States, we're already in a manufacturing recession. We're already in a transportation recession. We're already in a corporate earnings recession. We're already seeing all kinds of trouble, which I document regularly on my website, where we're seeing literally dozens of data points which point to an economic slowdown already happening. And that's what we'll notice first. In the short term, we're going to go into a recession. Things are going to get bad. But beyond that, what we're going to experience is what Gerald Celente, who I know you're familiar with, has referred to as the greatest depression. And he's been saying this for a while. And people say, oh, Gerald Celente was wrong. No, he's not wrong. He's just looking at the bigger picture. He doesn't know exactly when things are going to go off the edge of the precipice. But yeah, we are headed for the greatest depression. John Paul Jackson has referred to what we're facing as the perfect storm, because it's not just economics we're facing, but all these things feed into one another. For example, geopolitics. We're talking about China. We're talking about the breakdown of trade with China, in which China and the United States together account for 40% of all GDP on the entire planet. So we're talking about not too far from half the global economy, China and the United States. And for decades, we've been very friendly. We've been working together. We've been trading together. But here, just within the past couple of weeks, we have witnessed, and most Americans don't realize this, the mainstream media doesn't realize this, but over in China, they realize this. We have witnessed the complete and total breakdown of relations between the United States and China. Because what happened is, over in China, people need to realize, how they deal with protesters, how they deal with unrest. Well, they run them over with tanks and they ship them off to concentration camps. But we've seen this thing with Hong Kong, where they're supposed to have the special status. It was supposed to be one country but two systems, and so it's kind of a special case. And so China hasn't known quite how to deal with those protesters in Hong Kong. But in terms of how the Chinese government views them is still the same as how they view any other type of protesters. And that's basically the protesters in Hong Kong, which the government in China considers them to be anti-Chinese terrorists, basically our equivalent of ISIS or Al Qaeda, is how they view those protesters in Hong Kong. And so the Chinese have, in fact, the Chinese government has publicly accused the United States of originating those protests, which have been going on for several months, of being behind those protests, of fueling those protests. And now what we witnessed in recent days is in the U.S. House of Representatives, a pro-democracy resolution was passed supporting the Hong Kong protesters. And it was passed by a vote of 417 to 1. It was passed unanimously by the U.S. Senate, and it was signed into law by President Trump. So this sends a message to the Chinese that, hey, we're with the Hong Kong protesters, which the Chinese government considers to be basically Al Qaeda or ISIS terrorists, the equivalent of that. And so what we've done is we said the United States government this is our policy. It's not going to change no matter what happens in the next election, no matter if Republicans or Democrats are in control. And we basically aligned ourselves with what the Chinese consider to be a horrible, horrible terrorist. They're the enemy of their government. So what we've essentially done, Greg, is we've made ourselves and openly, publicly declared ourselves to be the enemy of the Chinese government. This is how the Chinese view it. Most Americans couldn't care less about this. They don't understand. But over in China, this is the biggest thing. This is all they're talking about. And now they view us as their primary global enemy. So there's not going to be any type of comprehensive trade agreement. You can forget that. And that's one of the only things holding the stock market up is hope, maybe the U.S. and China will agree to a trade agreement. And President Trump keeps talking it up. There's not going to be a comprehensive trade agreement. There is no future for the United States and China. In fact, we are now bitter enemies, and China has all sorts of ways that they can make us hurt, make us painful. But what this is going to do, and we're already seeing global trade has been declining steadily for months. We're already basically in a global trade recession as well. But what this is going to do, it's going to hurt global trade all over the world as the U.S. and China decouple from one another. Going to be extremely chaotic. Of course, China is evil. It's a deeply tyrannical regime. We should have never been trading with them in the first place, going back for decades. But we did. We deeply integrated our economy with China. And now this decoupling is going to be extremely chaotic. China has about $1 trillion of our debt. We're deeply dependent on China for all sorts of things. Our farmers desperately need to sell their crops to China. And so this is just one element geopolitically, which is also going to affect economics very, very dramatically.
Breaking up is hard to do, as they say. And you think more down days, the trajectory for the stock market. Funny, Bo Pony said the same thing. Actually called me a few days ago and said, hey, Monday and Tuesday is going to be rough. I've been off a little bit on the timing, but the trajectory is going to go down. Do you think the trajectory for the stock market is going to continue downward?
Definitely, Greg. And ultimately, the stock market is all about what people think is going to happen in the future. And there's been, over the past few years, there's been a lot of hope for the future, even though the economy really has been stagnating, even though there's been a lot of negative signs. In general, investors have been hopeful for the future. When you take that hope away, we're not just going to see some down days. We're not. But ultimately, you see, ultimately, the stock market always returns to its long-term averages in terms of stock valuations, in terms of these ratios that investors look at, in terms of what is a fair stock price. And right now, in order to get to stock price to earnings valuations and all that, to get back to the long-term averages, the stock market would have to fall by 40 or 50% just to get back to the long-term averages. And the market always returns to the long-term averages eventually. But if we just return to the long-term averages, well, our financial system today is so overextended and so living right on the edge that we could not afford that type of dislocation, because it would just basically melt everything down and cause a massive financial crisis far beyond anything we saw in 2008. Now, that's assuming we just return to the long-term averages, which should happen, by the natural course of events anyway. But basically, we're in an environment right now of not just economic problems, but all over the world. We're witnessing political shaking, including in Washington, D.C. We're witnessing civil unrest literally all over the planet, whether you're talking about Chile, you're talking about Hong Kong, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran. I mean, all over the planet right now, civil unrest is breaking out all over the place. The weather's going crazy. We're witnessing just weather extremes all over the world. Crop failures. And here in the United States, the harvest season was a disaster because we've had blizzard after blizzard after blizzard roar through the middle part of the country, totally wreck harvest season. And I mean, we're 3 weeks away roughly from the start of winter. We haven't even gotten to winter yet. It's still several weeks away. And we've had blizzard after blizzard, historic storm after historic storm. We're witnessing earthquakes. We're witnessing all over the world. We're witnessing unusual seismic activity. It's going to get a lot worse. And, you know, all these things feed into one another. We're on the verge of war in the Middle East between Israel and our neighbors. Where, you know, Iran and the United States, our tensions have never been hotter there, and, you know, in terms of what we've seen this year. So all these things are coming together, Greg, to really form a perfect storm. And at some point, investors are going to realize, hey, there's not going to be a trade agreement between the United States and China. Hey, war has erupted in the Middle East. You know, all these events are going to start to feed in one another, and it's going to take away hope for the future. People are going to say, hey, there is not going to be a positive future. And once investors fully realize that, the stock prices are going to be completely different from what we're seeing today, not just by hundreds of points, not just by thousands of points, but a complete and total paradigm shift as people realize the future is going to be exceedingly bleak.
Ray, we talked about this in the pre-interview, and just so people don't think that people like you and me are crazy, because, you know, I don't have a lot of money. I don't know what you have, but, you know, you're not Ray Dalio, who manages 160 billion. But oddly enough, Ray Dalio is kind of saying the same things you are. He manages 160 billion dollars, and he's out saying, "Wow, if we don't fix this economy, we're going to be all killing each other." This is Ray Dalio. Why do you think he's saying that? Is he seeing the same things you're seeing?
Oh, he is. And he's seeing some of the social tensions where the gap between the wealthy and the poor is greater than it's ever been in the United States today. And, you know, we've seen the stock market go up in recent years, but that benefits primarily the wealthy. In fact, the top 10% own 84% of all the stocks. So, as the stock market goes up, they get wealthier. Well, you know, the poor, you know, that they're kind of left behind. And so, and what we've got today, we've got a situation where the top 0.1% of all Americans control now as much wealth as the bottom 90% combined. So the truth is, most families out there are deeply struggling right now. In fact, you know, people say, well, most people have jobs. Well, since 1990, 63% of all the jobs created in the United States have been low-paying, low-wage jobs. So people are struggling. Half the country, according to the Social Security Administration, 50% of the country makes less than $33,000 a year, and you can't support a middle-class family on $33,000 a year. So, and that's one of the reasons why so many people are turning to debt, why consumers are $14 trillion in debt. In fact, a survey just came out that found that 48 million Americans are still paying off holiday debt from last year. It's because people are in this endless debt cycle where they're making the minimum payments. They're just scraping by from month to month. Survey after survey after survey has found that 60% or more of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. They have no financial cushion. And so what's going to happen, just like corporations are overextended, consumers are overextended, and we got to the last crisis, and all of a sudden people lost their jobs. And all of a sudden, they couldn't make the mortgage payment. They couldn't make the rent payment. They were put out on the street. They lost their homes. They went from living a relatively normal lifestyle to being out on the street very, very rapidly. So, and we're even more vulnerable today than we were last time around. So we're going to see the same thing this time around. You know, where the economy is going to plunge into a horrible recession. Corporations aren't going to be able to make their debt payments. They're going to go under. They're going to lay people off. People aren't going to be able to make their payments. In fact, auto loan delinquencies are already at the highest they've been since 2008. Corporate delinquencies in terms of looking at the junk bond market, those delinquencies are already on pace to be the highest they've been since 2008, the last crisis. We're already seeing these delinquencies rise. We're already seeing people get behind on their payments. So, I mean, we're already starting to see a slow motion replay of what happened in 2008, and it's going to continue to get worse as we go into 2020.
I don't know if the Fed, I've heard a lot of people say the Fed is not going to be able to do the same thing they did in 08 and 09. They're just not going to be able to do it. Or the dollar will be confetti. Do you think the Fed can? What's your view? Can the Fed just bail us out again and bring us right back for another 10 years or not?
Well, the Federal Reserve's already been trying, Greg. They've already been using up their ammunition that they should have been storing up to deal with a coming recession. For example, what you want to be able to do when a recession comes under a central banking paradigm, which we shouldn't even have a central bank, but under a central banking paradigm, what you want to have is you want to have interest rates at a level where you can cut interest rates to help things when we get into a recession. But the Federal Reserve has already been cutting interest rates, even though they tell us, oh, the economy's fine, there's not a problem. Oh, but we're cutting interest rates several times anyway, because they know the truth. They know the economy's heading for a recession, so they're trying to prevent that by cutting interest rates, but they've already cut them, so close to the floor that when the next recession comes, they're not going to have much ammunition at all to use. In addition, we've already seen them starting to pump just massive amounts of money into the financial markets. They're saying, well, this isn't quantitative easing, but it really is, and everybody kind of knows that. But this is an emergency measure, just like cutting interest rates. This is an emergency measure that shouldn't be used until a crisis actually comes. And so what are they going to do when a crisis actually comes? Are they just going to keep printing and printing and printing? Well, we've seen that. We've seen what happened in Zimbabwe. We've seen what's happened in South America. We've seen what's happened in so many places where eventually the money just becomes toilet paper, becomes worthless. And already we're seeing inflation all over the country, where the cost of a college education, I just wrote about the other day, over the past decade has increased well over 100%. More than the rate of inflation, where health insurance far increasing far greater than the overall rate of inflation. You go to the grocery store these days, it's hard to get out of there, without spending a couple $100 on just one cart of food. And of course they massage the numbers and they try to make inflation, the official number, look low. But the truth is that everyone can see that inflation is already very aggressive. And in the future, the Federal Reserve will create money, will cause tremendous inflation. It is coming. And that, of course, that's going to push up the price of gold, the price of silver, all these things. But, and as we get toward the end game. But, Greg, the Federal Reserve, the central banks around the world are already losing control because, they've been able to extend the bubble for a while by pushing interest rates, in some cases negative interest rates around the world. They've created tons and tons of money, and yet the global economy is still slowing down right now. So they were able to extend things for a while, but their tricks are losing their effectiveness. It's not working right now, and right now the entire global economy is slowing down. And they're going to get desperate.
What happens when they get desperate? What do they do then?
Well, when they get desperate, they kind of jump the shark. They create money. They do all these things, which it creates inflation. It creates panic. It creates instability. And eventually, you're going to go to the store and you're going to be like, why am I paying $5 for a loaf of bread? Why am I paying $10 for a gallon of milk? And see, because they create this inflation, but our paychecks are not rising. And so our standard of living goes down. And it's been going down steadily for quite a while, but it's going to accelerate. And it's going to get to the point where people are like, wow, I can't even afford the basics. In fact, for a lot of families around the country today, they can't afford the basics. But we're going to get to such a crisis point where the dollar is going to be kind of worthless. And it gets to the point where we degrade the dollar, the US dollar, so much that the rest of the world's been using our currency for decades, and one of the reasons is because it's been so relatively stable compared to other currencies around the world. But eventually you degrade it so much the rest of the world loses confidence in it, then we lose our status as a reserve currency of the world. In fact, Russia and China are already moving away from it, and China is really talking about moving away from the dollar now. And we lose that status of the dollar being the default, the reserve currency of the world. Our standard of living really goes down then.
I'll ask you this because we're going to wrap it up here in just a minute. What is people say, you always ask this, and I ask this of everybody. What does the little guy do? What are you doing to protect your family? What does the little guy do to protect his family? I know it gets down to, cut your data package and get rid of cable TV and buy some canned food. But what are you telling people to do? What would you tell people to do?
In terms of my wife and I, if the
Yes.
stock market goes down, we're not going to lose a single penny because we're not exposed to that risk. And, a lot of people out there, they think, well, the market's been going up for a while. Maybe these doom and gloomers, these people like Greg Hunter, Michael Snyder, and all these others, maybe they were wrong. Maybe everything's going to be fine and we're fine having money in the stock market, having money exposed to all this. Well, people can keep, making that gamble if they want. But in the long term, that's not going to be so wise. But beyond that, whatever you can do to become more independent of the system. I mean, a lot of people are totally dependent on their jobs, and a lot of just like last time around, millions of people are going to end up losing their jobs. It's going to be very, very painful. So if people can create something of their own, whether it's a side business, whether it's even just selling something on eBay, whatever you can do to bring in some income of your own, that's a good thing. Or, becoming independent, it also means growing a garden, learning to grow some of your own food, getting off the grid, whatever you can do to become more independent of the system in the long term is going to benefit you because the system is failing. People that have faith in Wall Street, people that have faith in Washington, people that have faith in the Federal Reserve, in the system, ultimately that faith, they're going to be extremely, extremely disappointed. And people are going to most Americans are going to be blindsided by what's coming because most people have no idea what's coming. Absolutely no idea.
I mean, some people you just tell people things like this: go out and buy yourself 10 cases of water at Costco. That'll be $3.50 a case, roughly. That'll be $35. And they're like, "What? 10 cases of water? I don't want to do that." You don't want to spend $35. Without water, you die. I'll go out and buy yourself a few, some canned food because it's never going to be cheaper and it'll last for 10 years. I mean, you tell people that and they, but wouldn't that be a way to soften the blow? I mean, have some storable food. Even if we don't get into, Armageddon, Mad Max, and you can't walk out of your house, but we get into this declining standard of living, accelerating inflation. Wouldn't that be just a way to tell poor people, hey, you can buy canned food and water?
Yeah, and Greg, what we're facing is far more than just rising prices. I mean, literally, Greg, the UN is saying 25% of all the pigs in the world are already projected to die. The pork prices in China are already absolutely skyrocketing through the roof because their pigs, millions and millions and millions of pigs are dying over there. And this African swine fever is sweeping the planet. Pigs are dying. We're basically, when you're talking about global protein, you're talking about beef, chicken, fish, and pork. And basically, we're looking at a pork apocalypse where basically, 25% is kind of the low end of the figure of the pigs that are going to die worldwide. So literally our entire planet is dying. Global weather patterns are going crazy. Crops have been this was the most disastrous season for U.S. farmers in modern American history, and crops are failing all over the world. People don't understand. I've been detailing all these things on my website. And this is just one aspect of the meltdown of the perfect storm that's coming. And the biggest reason for this, Greg, is not just economics. It's not just politics. But the truth is that America has turned away from God. We've turned our back on the values that this nation was founded upon. We fully embraced evil, and there's a price to be paid when a society goes off the deep end, fully embraces evil. If we stay on the path that we are on as a society, we're not just going to have an economic meltdown. We're not just going to have hard times. If we stay on the path that we're on as a country, there's not going to be an America. So we're not just talking about Mad Max. We're not just talking about Armageddon. We're talking about the end of America. So in the long term, if people want to prepare, you need to be prepared for literally the end of our country.
Well, there's a lot of people out there praying, and a lot of people voted for Trump, who says, that he believes in God, and in every of his rallies, he does give praise to God. So we're not Sodom and Gomorrah quite yet. There are some people that believe in Christ and God. I'm one of them. I know you are too. But anyway, but what you're saying, and I wanted people to know this too. You are you always back up all your stuff with statistics and sources and sourcing. You don't just come up and willy-nilly. You're always laying out links and sources. So when you're talking about, the failing of the system, as you just said, you got sources and links and all kinds of research to back this up, which is really truly the scary part, and you can't get that from the mainstream media.
Oh yeah, if you go to the most important news.com or the economiccollapseblog.com, and every single article, people say, "Oh, Michael, where do you get all these numbers? Where do you get all this stuff?" Well, all you got to do is click on the link and go to the original source, or go to the government document, or wherever I got it from. But really, I know a lot of people. Yeah, we elected Trump in 2016, and it was an opportunity for America to go in a fundamentally different direction. But instead, we continued to pile up our debt. We've continued to embrace just about every form of evil that you can possibly imagine. Just the other day, there was an article where syphilis, gonorrhea, and all these other sexually transmitted diseases, all-time record high in this country. We not only embrace every form of sexual immorality that you could possibly imagine, but we film it and ship it overseas. We produce more pornography than the rest of the world combined. We export it all over the world. Hollywood is a cesspool of filth. We export that all over the world. And so 2016 was an opportunity to say, hey, America, you can go in a different direction. We haven't. And so the future, Greg, is exceedingly bleak. And this is something I document. Now, do I want this to happen? No, I wanted America to choose a different path, a different direction, but we didn't. We haven't under President Trump. And people say, oh, there's still a lot of Christians around. Actually, the percentage of Christians in America is at an all-time record low. The percentage of Americans that believe in any type of biblical values is at an all-time record low. And the percentage of Americans that embrace whether, any type of evil that you can imagine, and public opinion after public opinion show it's increasing. It's increasing among Republicans. It's increasing among so-called conservatives. And if this continues, there's no positive future for our nation.
Michael Snyder, the Economic Collapse blog, I would say, is probably your biggest one. The End of the American Dream, also your other, the Most Important News. You're a prolific writer. You write a lot. You're a big thinker. You back everything up. Michael Snyder, I hope you come back sooner than later. But thank you for coming on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you, Greg. Great to be with you.
Great to be with you too, my friend. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.